So that was the short version. In the story today, and really through the entire book of Exodus, we see this cosmic duel between God, these forces of good and evil, right? And we can see this in our worlds also, because there are these evil forces. There are things to be afraid of. And the Israelites were right to be afraid. And they were right to doubt and worry and even question Moses. We saw this part before they got to the Red Sea. And we heard the reading. Thank you very much for the beautiful reading, where the Egyptians were actually like questioning Moses and getting irritated with him. Like, did you bring us out to the desert just to wander around and die? I'd rather be a slave than go through this, right? They were like, this is not any fun. And how many times, just stop and think for a second, how many times in your own life have you really wanted something very badly? And then when you start to get it, maybe it doesn't look like what you thought it was going to look like. Maybe it's a new job opportunity or a new relationship or a move or getting back together with family you haven't seen for a long time, anything. It can be something very simple. And sometimes it doesn't look like what we thought it was going to look like. And can we start to doubt and question, or maybe we get there and it's everything we ever wanted, and then we say, can I really do this? Like imposter syndrome sets in. Just stop and think for a second and remember sometimes that that's happened to you. And that makes the story that's real, this Bible story that we remember, even more relatable because it's still there for us to continue to relate to throughout our lives. So we think about this moment and we can really relate to the Israelites. They seem like whiny children, right? How would you really want to go back to being a slave, right? But they're like, well, at least we get to live because we don't want to die in the desert. Okay, fair point. That makes sense. So they were right to complain and to question. And our fears, our feelings, they actually are a form of safety for us. They're another part of information and connection to God. But when we get stuck in them, then we miss the opportunity. So just for a second, let's look at kind of the metaphor part of this story. Because, again, we're talking about these cosmic forces of good and evil, right? And this idea in this story where the Egyptians have enslaved the Israelites. And the Israelites are the chosen people, the true believers who understand in the one and triune God. They're the true believers. And in the story, we are the Israelites because we also are true believers. And so the concept of being enslaved, even though it happens in this story, for us, we can relate to how we become slaves to just our humanness. We become slaves to just our day-to-day. We become slaves to the negative feelings and thoughts and worries. And we forget to turn and to trust and to talk to God and to walk with that on a regular basis. We forget that that's an option when we're just doing the next thing. And that's common. We are humans. We're going to do that. We're going to say, I'm falling asleep at the wheel here. But in this story, we see this man, Moses, who stands apart from the Israelites. And what he does is he turns to God over and over again. So even in this moment where he's been captured and he's living in captivity, he continues to talk to God. And so God explains to him about this plan, and he follows through with it, and he knows it's not going to look perfect immediately. And he's like, that's okay, we're going to do it, right? And God lets him know that he will come to what seems like a dead end of this Red Sea. But if he just has faith, he will be able to hold out his staff and part the waves. And that part is the part that seems so strange, but also amazing things happen all the time. We've all lived through metaphorical and literal storms. And we've seen how powerful and amazing the weather is and the wind conditions and all of that. And so what happens in this lesson is that we are shown how when things are stormy, figuratively or literally, we can walk by faith, not by sight. We can still have the faith and the knowledge that God is with us always. We're always connected to God, even in the bad parts. There's a lot of bad parts to life. As a communications coach, I teach people about like the basics of feelings and how to process our feelings and kind of cycle out of fight or flight in the moment. And we always talk about kind of the building blocks or the four corners of our feelings being mad, glad, sad, and scared. And only one of those is positive. We have a lot of opportunity to be human and feel these funky feelings, right? So in this story, we see the Israelites expressing this humanity, sharing all their negative thoughts and feelings. And we see Moses just staying on that path. And even though they're grumbling and questioning, the Israelites choose to just have a little faith too. They may not have as much faith as Moses does, and so they're kind of not in on the plans, but they have enough faith to say, he seems really well connected. So I'm going to follow him still. Now, in this awesome outline of this talk that Pastor Ruth is using, these stories are retold and helping all of us to reconsider these Bible stories. I love that it's outlined. And when she and I were talking about this, there are some really interesting pop culture references that are here. And both of us were like, do you know these? I don't know these either. Let's not use these. But there's one that I'm going to keep. You're going to have to bear with me for a second because it's a horror story. And it's really weird to talk about horror stories in church. But actually, if we look at this arc, this momentous moment here where they're at the Red Sea, it's kind of like the big crescendo of a horror story in a way. Because what happens is this amazing storm. God has said to the Israelites that my angel went before you and then now comes behind you. And that the skies and the storm and all of this is happening and that you get this little path. That is how weather works, right? And so what's really amazing is here they come. And this is what happens. And going back to the metaphor, I want to read something for you before we really talk about this big scene where they escape the bad guys. So I'm going to quote something here. And it comes from a blog that, if you'd like, I can give you the link. It's here also. A blog called Pathos Evangelical, and the author is Rebecca Florence Miller. And she writes about, the title of this blog post is very interesting. It's OCD, Stephen King's It, and Facing Our Fear. And, you know, part of the falling asleep that the Israelites have done in this story is, like the Egyptian representation, is just ritual without reverence. It's like just worship that's just about the ritual and not being connected to God. And that's the part that we can really fall asleep to. Even when we're here, we can forget to bring that reverence with us and to be fully present and really interacting, right? And so it's really interesting how even when we think we're doing the right thing, we have to wake up to that sometimes and be even more present. How can we get even more present? And I really think it's interesting that this blog post talks about OCD because obsession compulsive disorder talk about ritual that's just not, you know, it's just religious. It's just ritualistic. It's almost superstitious a lot of times. A lot of times with OCD, there's this thought that if I tap this many times or if I check every pothole, I'll keep my parents from dying or something, right? It's actually referred to in mental health spheres as supernatural thinking. Supernatural concept that we can do these little rituals and prevent things from happening that are going to be inevitable anyway, instead of sitting with our anxiety and learning what it means, right? And so we can learn how to cycle out of that as well. And in this blog post, I'm going to quote, the quote is, if we are honest about our own experience of evil, let's go back to evil for a second because I forgot that part. Does everyone know Stephen King? Raise your hand if you've never heard of this guy, Stephen King. You've heard of him, right? You beat me to the punch there. We've all heard of Stephen King, right? And I don't watch a lot of the Stephen King movies, but as a writer, I love to look at his short stories and see like how the arc has developed. Like, what are the concepts he wrote about initially back in the 70s and 80s? And then how have these morphed into these amazing movie franchises and these whole concepts, right? And in his original short story of It, which was set in New England, as all his stories were in the beginning, right? There's just this evil that lurks in the sewers of this subdivision because evil is out there, right? And it does sometimes lurk in our own backyards. That's real. That's a real fear. And it can become this pervasive, foreboding, just fear, like it's everywhere, if we get too afraid and we get stuck in our thinking and too just ritualistic to be present to. There is good also. God the good, right? God the creator of all. And so it's interesting how in this movie franchise, it has morphed now into Pennywise, this evil clown who lives in the sewer system, right? And it's taken all the things that are whimsical and innocent and fun of this clown and turned them into evil, because that's the scariest part of all when something like that happens, as it also has in the real world. So in this article here, what Rebecca Florence Miller states is, if we are honest about our own experience of evil, it feels otherworldly and huge. We have that sense of hugeness of evil as children, in our fears of monsters hiding in our rooms, like in our beds or in our closets. But even as adults, there are times when evil feels so big and so powerful and supernatural, it seems impossible to be defeated. So now stop for a second and think about what feels like it's impossible to be defeated for you, because we definitely all have something. Miller continues, if horror reminds me of the transcendence of evil, it also reminds me of the transcendence of love. It reminds me that Jesus entered willingly into the full onslaught of the devil's evil and all the things we fear, and in the fight won the victory over the devil for us all, and showed us the way. And in this story, we have this big scene. This is where I really want to be out here talking to you for a second and say, picture with me this big scene in the horror movie that is the story of Moses and the Red Sea and the Israelites. They've already escaped the enslavery, right? They're running for their lives. They've wandered in the desert. They've been lost. And now they're on this pathway that Moses is telling them they just have to follow. And they come up to what looks like just a whole ocean. And they just seem like there's no escape. And what's going to happen? And there's this huge storm because, of course, right? In a big scene like that, there needs to be earthquakes and fire and all these things. But there is a huge storm and maybe a big symphonic soundtrack behind it if this really were the movie version. And then here comes Moses, and he puts his staff out with confidence and trust. He's got fear, and he still trusts God in that moment. And the storm clouds do their thing, and for that moment, the sea waves just part, just like he knew they would. And they all run through in this path. And as the Egyptians who are behind them can see this happening, they just blindly follow, because the Egyptians in this story represent this ritual without reverence. And they just keep following, not with faith, not even with thinking, just almost on autopilot. And then as they're coming through, the storms change and the waves crash down on them. And the Israelites get to the other side, and they turn and they see this horror scene of all the dead and drowning Egyptians. And they are overcome in this moment with their safety of the real dangers right there in front of them that are now fully behind them. They never lost their faith and trust in God, and they continue to be reverent, and it helps them through the rest of the Exodus stories. And I have a story that's much more mundane than that, about going to the bank and using this just Friday, because in my own life, right, I also get very stuck and very into the mundane, and my mundane can be just running errands with my children in the minivan. And they don't want to be there, and they're the bad guys following me. They're fighting, and I'm annoyed, but we're going to finish these errands, darn it, because that's the thing we're doing. And here I am doing this. This was just on Friday. And I had 2 checks to deposit, and one was for one bank and one was for another bank. And I was like, okay, we're by this bank and we're going to do this thing. And I've had these checks and I've got them together in my purse in one envelope. And here they are. I've been protecting these 2 checks. And we get into the drive-through line and thanking the teller, asking for my deposit slip, and then kind of preoccupied while I'm doing that and digging in my purse and trying to find this. And I pull out the envelope, and guess what? The check for the bank I'm at isn't in the envelope. I was like, what? I've been protecting this. I don't understand what's been going on. And I'm looking and looking. I'm getting more and more upset because here come the feelings, and I'm just not paying any attention to what they're telling me. And I finally just had to apologize and pull out and park, and actually got out of the car so that, I don't know, I thought that this would be a better view for me in the purse. And so here I am digging through this small purse and still can't find this. And then because I do talk to God on a regular basis, I just realized that I was getting frenetic, and I just started talking to God while I was doing it. And I said, okay, God, you know where this check is more than I do. Please help me find it. And my kids were like, Mom, no way. And I said, yeah, that's how it works, actually. Because we can all do this on a regular basis in just our little day-to-day lives. We can do this. We can just say, okay, God, you have a better view than I do. Help me figure some things out here, right? Where am I being surly with my family? Where am I not forgiving my neighbors? Where am I holding my fellow servants accountable to things that I've actually been forgiven for if I really think about it? So we can always come back to that too. These Bible stories, Sunday school stories, right? They're not just for Sunday school. They're for using all the time, which is really amazing and also very freeing. So we trust in God in good times and in bad. When it feels like we're being chased by the bad guys, even if they're just in our own heads, we can take this kind of action. It's easy to trust in God when he leads you into a green field with a blue, sunny sky. But what about when he leads you to a Red Sea? This Sunday school story shows us the power of trusting God always, no matter if things are going as planned or not.